everybody. Welcome to Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined by Dan Schorr, and thanks for joining us on the program where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We want to get started with what's on the rundown for today. Let's go. First up, I want to preview a brand new case that we're going to be covering here on the network. We expect jury selection to begin tomorrow. It is the case of Cheyenne Harris out of Iowa. Now, why does this name sound familiar? Well, she has been charged with murder and child endangerment in connection with the death of her 4-month-old son, Sterling Keene. Now, why does that name sound familiar? Because you see the man on the right, the father of this 4-month-old. We covered his trial here on Law&Crime. He was charged with the same thing and was found guilty of murder and child endangerment in connection with the death of this young infant. And what a sad, really tragic case that we covered here about this baby who was found dead in his swing. And he had died. Medical examiner testified that the baby died from malnutrition, dehydration, and an infection from a diaper rash. And these two parents have been charged with the death. One has already been found guilty, and we're about to cover the trial of the mother. So again, we believe jury selection will begin tomorrow, but if we get an update in that case, we're going to make sure to let you know. Now, let's switch gears and focus on one of our live trials of the day. We're going to California, and we're talking, of course, about the Charles Merritt case. This is the Mcstay family murder trial. We have been following it day in, day out. We expect the live feed at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Here's a report from our very own Rachel Stockman talking a little bit more about this trial.
Charles Merritt is facing murder charges for allegedly killing a family of 4 and burying their bodies in the desert. Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Mcstay Jr. vanished from their Southern California home on February 4th, 2010. Police found no evidence of struggle or foul play, but did identify signs that the family left in a hurry. The family car was found 4 days later abandoned at the Mexican border with no sign of the Mcstays. Law enforcement eventually believed the family fled to Mexico. Surveillance video at the border showed a family of 4 resembling the Mcstays crossing the border on foot. Officers also found search history on the family computer about travel to Mexico and passports for children. But a grisly discovery came nearly 4 years later when an off-road motorcyclist discovered the partial remains of a child's skull on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert. A search revealed 2 shallow graves containing the remains of 3 more bodies. DNA and dental records matched the bodies to that of the Mcstay family. A 3-pound sledgehammer was buried with the bodies. The family had been bludgeoned to death, according to prosecutors. As law enforcement was investigating the Mcstay's family disappearance, San Diego detectives interviewed Charles Merritt, a business partner of Joseph Mcstay. According to the affidavit, it was determined that Merritt was the last person to see and talk to Joseph alive. The two had met at a fast food restaurant before the family went missing. The last cell phone activity on Joseph's phone was a call to Charles Merritt. Merritt's DNA was also found on the family car abandoned at the border on the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the radio. He claimed he never driven the car, but rode in the passenger seat with Joseph 6 weeks prior to when the family went missing. Charles Merritt is pleading not guilty to the charges. Defense attorneys are pointing to another business associate as a possible suspect. Merritt is facing 4 counts of murder. For Law&Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
Thank you, Rachel. Now let's talk about that gravesite. Our very own executive trial producer, Kathy Russin, visited that gravesite, and she has more. Take a look.
We are currently at the site where the remains of that family of 4 was found at the end of 2013, nearly 3.5 years after the family went missing. A motorcyclist came across the skull here, and investigators eventually found 2 shallow graves with the remains of the family. Now, this location is just north of Victorville, California in San Bernardino County. Prosecutors say Charles Merritt killed the Mcstay family in their home in San Diego County and eventually drove the bodies here and buried them. It was a 3-pound sledgehammer. The cause of death is said to be blunt force trauma to the heads of this family of 4. The prosecutors in their opening statements say that Charles Merritt drove them here and that you can see a set of tire tracks. Now, it's very hard to see them now because so much time has gone by. I can actually see a little bit of them, but they were very clear, but even back 3.5 years after the family went missing. There's another set of tire tracks about 20 feet over. There are 2 actual grave sites. This is a memorial that the family put up, but just to the bottom of this is where the first grave was. The second one was about 20 to 25 feet over there. Now, the defense in their opening statements say that more evidence points to a third business partner, Dan Kavanaugh. They also say that evidence here at this scene show that there were more than one person that committed this. They told jurors they will see the 2 sets of tire tracks and they will see that they're not consistent with the same vehicle. They also put the theory up that Joseph Mcstay was killed, brought here, and that Summer and the boys were brought here alive and then killed here. They say that the family was not killed at their home. There is no evidence of any blood or any DNA found at the home to show the family was killed there. The trial is expected to last up to 6 months, and Charles Merritt will face the possibility of the death sentence if he's convicted. I'm Kathy Russin for Law and Crime.
Thanks, Kathy. We're all trying to get answers to what happened to the Mcstay family, and that gravesite is providing some answers. Now, let's talk about some of the testimony that happened last week. We heard the recording of Charles Merritt's police interview tape back in 2010, 13 days after the Mcstay family disappeared. Let's see what he had to say. Take a look.
You know, it was very light. Did you notice if any of the lights in the house were on?
One. The office light.
The office light.
The lamp on the desk. But I can tell you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I know for a fact that that light, I have never seen it off. Okay? He always left it on because his kids get up in the middle of the night and they go downstairs and get water out of the refrigerator, and he always left that light on and the door open so that they didn't fall down the stairs and stuff.
Were any other lights on when you guys went there?
Not that I was downstairs, so I didn't see any lights upstairs anyway, but as far as I know, there was only the lamp. That was it.
Do you know who sleeps in what room?
I think they all sleep in the same room.
Okay, you know which room?
They go in the master bedroom. There's a kiddie play thing on the right-hand side. His blow-up mattress and kids, I think, are right next to each other. I'm the one that went with him to Walmart and to Target, and we went shopping for blow-up mattresses for him because they didn't have the pods there. They don't have any mattresses. And I was actually with him when they got the mattresses, and I helped him blow them up. And so, yeah.
Did you see anywhere between the time they lived in San Jose and the time they lived in Boulder?
Yeah, at Joseph's mom's.
Oh, Joseph's mom's. Okay, so I was going to say, getting 3 days notice and then buying a house.
No, they were already in the process of buying the house.
Oh, they were when they got evicted?
When they got evicted, but I don't remember what day, but I don't even remember what day, but I stopped trying to call him because Mikey or his mom or somebody had told me his message box is full. Okay? But the last time I tried to call him.
Okay, that was some testimony from last week, and we have a lot to cover before the live feed at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So let's break it down right now with Law and Crime trial analyst and managing director at Ankara, Dan Schorr. Dan, great to see you and have you here. First Monday morning on Law and Crime.
Jesse, it's always great to be here with you.
Now, I don't know if we've had an opportunity to talk so much about this case, so I'd like your just general perspective. What do you make of this case so far? It is different than other ones we've covered here. What do you think of it?
Well, one thing is it uses every facet of law enforcement investigation. You have the computer forensics, you have DNA, you have cell phone records, you have interview witnesses, you have a statement from the defendant where they're trying to parse words that he might have used and whether that means something. You have people who were missing for 3 years before they were found. So this is a very complicated investigation, and it really challenges the prosecutors because when they sum up at the end, they have to tie it all together in a comprehensive way that the jury can understand. It's not as clear as this person killed that person, you have a confession or you have a direct witness to it.
You talked about it being complicated. Is one of the reasons it's complicated is we don't know where they were killed? There's a back and forth of whether or not it even happened in the home or it happened in the Mojave Desert. We know their bodies were found in the Mojave Desert, but how'd they get there? Is that one of the complications?
Definitely. When people are missing for a certain period of time before the bodies are discovered, often there are questions about were they killed at the scene, were the bodies moved, and how someone was killed is often relevant to who killed them, because who could have done it that way? Would this type of killing involve multiple people? And there's some suggestion that that might be the case. When people are dead for a long period of time, some of that evidence goes away, and it's not as clear that multiple people were involved.
It seems if the killings happened in the house, it's more likely than not, or it seems more believable that he would have done it since he had access to it. I'm talking about Charles Merritt. Do you believe, based upon the evidence presented so far, that the killings happened in the house?
I don't, because the house doesn't seem to be disturbed in that way. There's food out. There doesn't seem to be a disturbance in the house. There's no evidence of a struggle, especially when someone might be trying to kill multiple people. There's going to be a struggle. You can't sneak up on 4 people and kill them all. It's very difficult. And there's no sign of a struggle there. The house was looked at by law enforcement a few days afterwards.
I'm going to press you on that right now at the next break, because there was some evidence tying back to that house, including what was found in the Mojave Desert. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to discuss, so stay tuned here on Law and Crime.
Or have you ever thought that you wasn't covering the kids are dead?
I try not to think about that, actually. Mikey and his mom keep saying, things like that, but, I don't know of anybody that's hurt Joseph, or 2 little kids for that matter. So,
Do you have any knowledge or information that indicates to you that they're dead? The reason I ask is because you have used the past tense about Joe a couple times, and you said Joe was. Typically, people don't do that for a while. Any explanation as to why you may have done that?
No, not really. I just,
Do you understand what I'm asking?
Of course. Of course. I completely understand. But no, I never really even thought of him as possibly being, I can't say I haven't thought of him as possibly being dead, but I have, but I don't like to think of it that way, of course. So,
It's interesting because, we deal with families and friends and people all the time. And oftentimes they'll notify them that their loved one is dead, and they will still use the present tense because it really hasn't set in. And that's why I'm asking you to use the past tense a couple times, which is really unusual.
yeah. Everybody told Joseph, don't marry her. Don't marry her. Because she's a pain in the butt. She's very, very difficult. He always said, no, she's just Colombian, he talked all the time about her being Colombian as it's something positive, my little Colombian girl. And I'm like,
Speaking of Colombian, does she have friends or family or connections with people in Colombia?
I have no idea. All I know is she's Colombian because he always said she was Colombian. I always assumed that she was just Colombian by descent, and American, but he was always just very positive.
All right, that's Charles Merritt talking about the Mcstays. Back here with Dan Schorr. I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question that I keep asking everybody when we listen to this. Does it mean he's guilty because he used the past tense when describing the Mcstays, Joseph Mcstay, 13 days after the family disappeared? It was a missing persons case. It wasn't a murder case yet. Suspicious, Really doesn't matter. What do you think?
It's definitely suspicious. It doesn't mean he definitely is the killer, but if someone's missing and you start referring to them in the past tense, almost implying like that person is dead, there's the question which the police officer raised on that audio. Well, why are you referring to him in the past tense when he could be alive?
You've seen this before. You've seen defendants do this.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's an indication that they know something about the person being dead, not alive. However, I would caution reading too much into someone's semantics because you never know why they're using a certain word, but certainly it's suspicious.
It definitely is suspicious. I want more answers to that. We're going to hopefully get it. Let's play a little bit more of Charles Merritt's interview where he talks more about Joseph Mcstay.
A super nice guy. I mean, he'll give you the shirt off his back. I mean, he'll do anything for you. And Summer's just the opposite. She's well, I don't know so much about that, but she won't give up anything. What's hers is hers, and what's hers is going to stay hers. And Joseph is more like, you need what? There you go. Hell, I mean, I've got, mine and Joseph's running tab is $10,000. He owes me $10,000. I owe him $15,000. He owes me $5,000. I owe him $15,000. It just goes. And Summer never liked that because it was never. It was just always a running tab. If I needed money, I'd pick up the phone and say, "Hey, dude, I need a couple of $1,000." If he needed something done, he picks up the phone. Hey, dude, I need, we got it done. Whatever it was, we got it done.
Are you having any financial problems?
We've been having financial problems for 6, 7 months, 8 months.
Why is that?
Well, it's just, business has been, it dropped right out from under us for like 3 months. There was almost no sales at all, and that killed us financially. My heart attack didn't help much.
Okay, learning more about the relationship between the defendant and the victims. Dan, let's move into motive real quick, and then we'll get into the Gravesite on the next break. Motive here, really interesting. He did have a motive. I mean, he did have something to gain with the Mcstays out of the way, but is it enough for murder?
Right, he had a financial motive. He may have been owed money in the business. He was able to make financial transactions, allegedly, that could have helped him afterwards. So he had a financial motive. That's not enough, obviously. That's what I was talking about before. There's a lot of different things that have to be pieced together. There's the DNA evidence. There's maybe a cell phone ping near the burial site. There's whether or not he drove this car. There's the words he used in his interview. And then there's financial motive. And it's putting that all together to try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty of murder.
The defense has a tough job here, right? They can't say, you can't say our client would kill an entire family for money when their theory is that this guy named Dan Kavanaugh, another business associate, they saying did the same thing, killed the whole family for money. So they have a tough job here, don't they?
Right, and Dan Kavanaugh seems to have been out of town, maybe in Hawaii during the time of the murders. But they're saying someone else had a motive, that Dan Kavanaugh had made comments about making two people disappear later, referring to other people. So they're trying to cast aspersions on somebody else, which is smart from a defense tactic. But right, they can't dismiss financial motive as being a possibly relevant factor here, but they could try to spin that around and say, look, he was doing business dealings with the victim here. Maybe he would lose out in the long run if he wasn't around to do business with him again. So they don't have to adopt that finding that he had a motive financially.
Does it appear to you that he was, even when they were missing, if he had nothing to do with their disappearance, that he was doing something improper by allegedly gaining access to his accounts and paying and having, Mcstay's mother pay him? I mean, something doesn't add up, the smell of it.
Right. If you were missing and I was doing business with you and I needed to make financial transactions on your account to keep the business going, I would document that. I would be transparent about it. I would be open about that. I would say, so it's clear that I'm not doing it for some secret motive. He didn't do that. So the fact that he did it under the radar, and that is very suspicious.
Okay. Well, we have a lot more to talk about in terms of motive, but when we come back, we'll talk more about the evidence from the Gravesite and how it ties to the Mcstay family home. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back here on Law&Crime. Welcome back, everybody. We can't talk about the Mcstay family murder trial, which we've been doing, without talking about the gravesite. We know that the bodies of these 4 people were found in 2 shallow graves, and last week was a further investigation, a further analysis of the evidence found at these grave sites. Let's start right now with Detective Edward Bachman, who is the lead investigator in San Bernardino, who talked more about what was discovered. Take a look.
We heard from Sergeant Avila about the documentation of some, I'm going to use the term loosely, tire impressions in the dirt area near grave A and B. Were you shown those?
I was.
Okay. Did you happen to examine those and get familiar with them?
I did.
So we heard from Sergeant Avila the approximate measurements of each and their location to grave A and B. What I want to ask you is something different, which is when you're looking at it in the context of the scene, what was significant to you about them?
Based on the layout of the tire impressions, it appeared that the soil at the time that they were caused would have been soft because they sank down below ground level. At the time when we drove out there, the scene was dry, and there wasn't a noticeable depression in the ground like there was when we examined the tire impressions that we believe backed up to both graves.
So is depression a better word than impression?
I would say so, yeah, because it's something that's pushed down into the ground.
Based on that observation and opinion, did you do any research about weather conditions on or near February 4th, 2010?
We did.
And what did you find?
We learned that at the time...
Here's that foundation.
Sustained. Excavation of the gravesite, was any other material besides that appeared to be wrapped around the remains located in grave A?
We located the victim's fingernails down on the bottom of the grave, the tire straps, the tie down, the electrical cord, the blanket, and then the victim's clothing.
Okay. Was there any towel-like or material located around the gravesite A, at least within a reasonable distance?
There was. It was visible around the area.
And would that have been documented by Ms. Radliff as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's talk about the gravesite real quick, Dan. The idea that they were found with the sledgehammer, something strikes me as odd about that. I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Well, look, it was the murder weapon, apparently. All 4 were reportedly killed by blunt force trauma, so it makes sense that the killer or killers would want to bury the weapon with them so the weapon's not discovered later on. What are they going to do with it afterwards, besides keep it there? Joseph Scott Morgan calls that connectivity. It seems strange that they would want to bury that with the bodies. And one of the things to note, too, I'm not sure if you heard this from last week, it was seen that on the sledgehammer appeared to be paint, which is interesting because it was believed that the Mcstay family home, there was painting going on. So another way to tie them to the house. Let's talk about that right on the next side of this clip. This is more of Detective Edward Bachman.
There were a handful of different folks on both days.
Did Becky Burnell work with you on the 12th?
I believe that was one of the folks that was assigned on the first day of accident, November 12th.
Mike Shea?
Yes, sir.
And Janine Rondon?
Yes, sir.
Did you guys measure the grave at some point when you were completed?
We did.
And it was 7'1", does that sound about right?
I think it was 71 inches.
Now, counsel showed you the picture of the soil depression before the excavation started.
Yes, sir.
That depression was measured at 3 different locations, was it not?
It was.
And do you remember those measurements?
I think it was approximately toward the north end was roughly 3 inches. I think at the center, the way my report reads is at the center it was roughly 4 inches, and then at the south end it was 6 inches.
And were you involved in the measurement of those tire depressions going to both graves?
Yes, I would have been present while that was taking place.
And did you agree with the measurements, how they're being done, like the placement of the tape measure ends and the determination of the width?
Agreed, how so?
But you didn't say, no, that's not right, that's not right. Were you agreeing with what everybody was kind of seeing?
I think based off of that, we were trying to take an approximate measurement. There was no tread pattern that was visible at that point. So we were trying to just take an overall approximate measurement of the actual depressions and stuff.
I understand, but did you state any objection to the process to which it was done or the determinations that were made?
I don't believe so, no, sir.
Let's just talk about the gravesite, because that's really what we're getting into here. We talked about the idea how the sledgehammer had paint on it. The Mcstay family home, there was believed to be painting. The bodies, it's interesting that they weren't wearing shoes, which would indicate that they maybe were taken from the home. And Joseph Mcstay's body, you couldn't even, there was nothing to even be detected beyond a certain point, beyond the knee. The idea also that he was wrapped up, the only one that was wrapped up and appeared to be bound in an electrical cord. What does this tell you? Does this tell you anything about where this happened and who might have done this?
I know there was renovation in the home, so there's a suggestion that you're making that maybe this happened in the home. I think one key thing, though, is that they were all killed by blunt force trauma, which is hard to accomplish in a home and then clean it up in a way that police aren't going to see some identification that there was a murder that went on.
What happens if they painted over it?
The police forensics unit should be able to discover, especially if it's not a planned killing, to go in and kill 4 people with blunt force trauma and be able to, and this isn't from what we know, an experienced killer, to then be able to clean it up in a way that a professional forensics unit can't detect signs of struggle, blood. That would be very, very difficult. Now, maybe he was able to lure them out of the home. Maybe he had help. That's another theory. And, you know, there's 2 different tire tracks from different vehicles that are supposedly at this gravesite. But it's hard to see how this blunt force trauma of killing of 4 people could occur in the home without any sign of a struggle that police could then identify.
But the idea of the order of killing, the fact that he was wrapped up, they weren't, does that tell you about the manner of killing, how it happened?
I mean, whether he was killed first and the other two were killed after. That's certainly possible. There's also evidence, the police say, that his wife was sexually assaulted before she was killed. So that would be consistent with him maybe being killed and her being sexually assaulted and then killed.
The prosecution hasn't put evidence of that in. We know about it because we're reading about the case and there was a police report about it, but the prosecution doesn't want to put that in. Why?
Maybe they will put it in later, or maybe they just feel they can't substantiate it. And if they start making an allegation like that and then they can't back it up, that could undermine their credibility across all the charges. But that is in one of the police reports that police do believe that. But if they don't feel they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, it's probably not worth bringing it up.
There are people who are watching the program and say, well, the prosecution doesn't want to put it in because it doesn't go with their theory. That why would Charles Merritt have raped her? This is about a financial crime. What would you say to that?
You know, whether he was raping her or not, it's not about a financial motive, obviously, but at that point where he's already killing, allegedly, the husband and either has killed or is about to kill the children, there's no limit to what kind of deviant behavior he might be engaged in as part of killing 4 people. So you can't say, well, he wouldn't rape her. He's willing to kill 4 people if he's guilty of these charges. So of course he could have raped her. That could have been part of what he did. It could have been what he did is beyond just a normal financial motive. There's whoever did this was angry, was enraged, blunt force trauma, killing 4 people, including 2 children, burying them in a shallow grave. This is a crime of anger, maybe motivated by finance, maybe other things, but certainly a sexual assault is possible as part of that. But if the prosecution doesn't feel confident in being able to prove that, then they don't want to introduce it because then it might undermine their whole case.
I guess people are looking at this, and me included, about practically how you're able to kill 4 people at the same time or what the order of it is. And I guess that's one of the reasons why they believe that this person, or there's multiple people who did this.
Right. The other thing is, and I've seen this with a lot of cases where the bodies are discovered years later, it's harder to piece together where people were killed and how they were killed. And those cases, by their very nature, often come down to showing motive, showing opportunity, showing someone's connection to where they were at certain times. It's hard to piece together every detail when the bodies are 3 years removed from when they were killed.
Well, we're trying to piece together the details based upon what we're learning at trial. We'll take a break right now. When we come back, we're going to hear from the forensic anthropologist who studied those bodies in the gravesite. We'll be back.
When you found the human skull, you described you were in a rivulet. Is that right?
Can I object that he said one question, we're on 2?
My apologies.
Well, I don't think it's like, not on a map, but just a contour of the land where it's a low point for water to go through.
And what were the weather conditions when you found what you believed was a human skull?
November-ish, partly cloudy and cold, windy probably a little bit.
And what were the ground conditions when you found it?
Dry.
Okay, let's talk about this. Dan, the Mojave Desert is huge. Isn't it incredible to think about that these bodies were found? I mean, this doesn't usually happen in missing persons cases, correct?
Well, bodies sometimes can be found years later. Right. This was by design. The bodies were placed in some place that the killer or killers thought the bodies would not be found. And it's possible that they weren't. Fortunately, this person did identify a skull, and that led to the obtaining of the whole crime scene and processing it and finding the bodies. But they could have gone unfound forever.
The idea of where the bodies were placed and the transport, and maybe even while we're at it, just the idea of who would have done this. Does that tell you something about the killer? Because this initially, when this investigation happened, they thought it might have been drug cartels. Seems pretty likely, based upon the manner of death and the way that the bodies were displayed, could have been a drug cartel killing. But the idea that it would have been Charles Merritt, this person who never had this past or seemingly had this past and just woke up one day and did this, does that give you a moment for pause, or should I say, hey, listen, people who've never killed before, never been involved in these crimes, they got to start somewhere?
Well, first of all, there were a lot of theories before the bodies were found. People thought that the family went to Mexico. There was surveillance video of a family that probably was a different family going into Mexico. So there were a lot of different theories. Was it a drug cartel? Was it somebody else? And I think you need to take a step back from the theories and look at what does the evidence show. You have 4 bodies who were brutally murdered, and they were found in the middle of the desert in a shallow grave. So could that have been Merritt? It certainly could have been. Could he have had help? That certainly would be helpful. It's tough to get 4 bodies, whether dead or alive, to a burial site and take care of them, kill them. Blunt force trauma is a messy way to kill people. So that indicates it might be multiple people. The prosecution is saying that this defendant either led this or did it by himself.
But I guess, look, we're trying to get into the mind of a killer here. How do you, if you kill Joseph Mcstay for a financial reason, how do you kill Summer and the boys? How do you do that? How does it happen?
Well, sometimes multiple people are killed because one person is killed out of anger and other people witness it, and then they're killed also because they would report it. But that's something that the prosecution can't rely on because that's just a theory. You have to show what they can really, what can they prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But why would he kill a whole family? Was he that angry, or was someone that angry to kill them all? Or was it just a fight with Mcstay, and once he was killed, they had to kill the person, or people had to kill the whole family? That's another way to go about it. But again, that's speculation.
Now, the defense, people are saying that there's not enough evidence to prosecute Merritt, but at the same point, the defense can't just sit back, right? They have to put on a very strong case here, don't they?
Right, and they are saying that there's another person, Kavanaugh, who is another business partner who also had a motive to lie, who in a different situation years later had made threatening comments to somebody else, and they're saying that's indication that he was violent, that he would do something like this. And of course, as we always say, the defense just has to show reasonable doubt. They don't have to prove their client's innocent. They just have to show there's reasonable doubt. So to say you can't totally tie him to these killings and someone else might have a motive and the ability to do it, that's going to change whether there's a conviction or not, possibly in the defense eyes.
We're going to talk more about that strategy and what they ultimately have to do to point the finger at a third suspect, but that's right after our next break. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to discuss more about the Charles Merritt case. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back.
The dripping, the drip, the flow stains right here, where the substance appeared to have flown or flowed towards the center. If it was being worn at the time, it would have been towards the center of the bra.
Okay, let's break this down right now. Joining me is Law and Crime trial analyst and managing director at Ankara, Dan Schorr. Dan is back with us. Dan, one of the things that we're trying to analyze is what can we learn from the grave sites. And we talked about the possibility of this crime maybe occurring in the house based upon the evidence. My question to you is, the way the bodies were positioned, the evidence that was left, the fact that the sledgehammer was left and maybe even had the presence of paint on the sledgehammer, does this tell you that a professional didn't commit this crime, that it was more haphazard, maybe somebody who never did this before? I'm curious.
It's possible, but I wouldn't draw that definite conclusion. The bodies were undiscovered for over 3 years, almost 4 years. So there was some kind of competency in whoever got the bodies to the desert, buried them. They were found by happenstance because someone discovered one of the skulls. Almost, it could have been that no one would have discovered them for a longer period of time. So I wouldn't necessarily say it was a professional or it wasn't. going back to the house, I'd be surprised if all 4 people were killed by blunt force trauma in that house in a way that the police would not be able to tell there was a struggle. Their forensic unit wouldn't be able to see blood or some other sign of a conflict.
Well, speaking of blood, there appeared to be blood spatter on the kitchen table. Now, the lead investigator in this case said that, in his opinion, based upon everything, he doesn't believe the killings happened in the house. But the jury's sitting there, and they remember seeing what looked like blood spatter, even though it couldn't definitively be said that that was blood spatter. This lead detective did say, in his opinion, it could have been. I'm curious what the jury's taking from that.
It could have been, but they said it wasn't. The police didn't think that it was a sign of the murder occurring there. And remember, you have 4 people killed by blunt force trauma. That is something that is hard to cover up, especially if you're just one person. Now, maybe if he had help, it's still difficult. One of the challenges here, if you have a crime scene that's discovered immediately with bodies there, police are very careful to have no one walk through, make sure it's untampered with, so you can get the best evidence. Here, you had 3 years where it was out in the open with the elements, with animals, and therefore it's difficult to get a perfect picture of what happened.
And then, since this was a missing persons case at the very beginning, people were coming in and out of that house, which is really questionable as well. We'll talk more about it. Let's take a break on our end, and when we come back, we'll have a lot more to discuss in the Mcstay family murder trial. Stay tuned. Everybody. So we're talking about the Mcstay family murder case, really tragic set of circumstances, and we have more questions than we do answers. And what we saw last week was more of a testimony about potential motive, or at least trying to understand the relationship between the defendant and Mcstays. That brings us to the testimony of David Joe Cicada. This is a man from Metro Sheet Metal, a business partner who had an issue with Charles Merritt, the defendant, and he was in business with Joseph Mcstay as well. Let's learn more details about this relationship from this witness.
How you came to know Charles Merritt through Metro Sheet Metal?
Well, my father was being an avid golfer, had quite a few friends, and there was a mutual friend that introduced my father to Mr. Joe Aragon, and at that time Mr. Merritt was working out of that shop, and the way I understood it, they were looking to free themselves of Mr. Merritt.
Objection, foundation, sustained to strike.
Last answer is stricken and jury's instructed to disregard.
Okay. So your understanding was Mr. Merritt was working for Mr. Aragon?
No, he was utilizing their facility.
Objection, foundation.
Not up for the truth matter at this point.
Sustained. The objection sustained.
Joseph's mom, Susan, had contacted us, and they were doing what they could on their end to try and locate Mr. Mcstay.
Was there ever a formal separation between the defendant and Metro Sheet Metal?
No, shortly after that, me and my father parted ways again.
Okay. Do you recall ever, after the Mcstays went missing, the defendant paying you or your dad or Metro Sheet Metal money for completed projects?
No.
Objection, foundation is he said he wasn't at the business anymore.
I asked if he was aware.
Overruled. Answer.
You said no.
Okay, Dan, now this is an important witness because, yes, he casts some suspicion on the defendant, but also paints him out to be a guy that really was not a great guy. And, you know, really important witness for the prosecution. I'm curious what your reaction to hearing that, and then we're going to move into some things about that he wasn't allowed to testify about.
Sure, it's certainly relevant to the financial motive that this defendant might have had. But remember, people often have financial motives to do something bad. Maybe they have a financial incentive or they can gain, but they don't then take the next step of killing someone and his family. So the question is, what was it about this situation, this person that might have gone that step, which is a huge leap? So part of it is financial motivation. It's also his behavior afterwards, the fact that there were financial transactions made on the Mcstay family's account for this business without authorization. So that all comes together as strange behavior, bad behavior, and a motive, and then there's other evidence, of course.
And again, like he said, the strange behavior, he didn't really seem too concerned that the Mcstay was missing. The part that I want to talk about is how much can the defense point the theory at this third suspect, Dan Kavanaugh, because he was asked under cross-examination, you were present at some conversations Dan Kavanaugh had with your father. Yes. Kavanaugh was calling your father and you and asking what you guys were doing with Joseph Mcstay. Objection by the prosecution. It wasn't allowed in. It was sustained. So this idea that perhaps Dan Kavanaugh wanted Joseph Mcstay out of the way, from what you've learned in this trial, what I just said, and reading about it, the defense is having a hard time putting in this evidence, right?
Right. Well, Dan Kavanaugh certainly had a conflict with Mcstay, and you could argue he had a motive. He'd also made certain comments in another situation about being aggressive and making someone disappear. He allegedly was not even in the continental United States at the time of the killing. But the defense is trying to show beyond a reasonable doubt, show a reasonable doubt that this other guy might have been the person who killed him. The other thing is, you never know what's going to mean something to a jury. So everything you throw at a jury then might lead to an acquittal. I
still want to get back to this third-party suspect because it's always interesting to follow. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to play more of Charles Merritt's interview. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about the Mcstay family murder trial. We'll be live in that courtroom at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but if we have an update from the courtroom, I'll make sure to let you know. In the meantime, we're recapping testimony that you may have missed, and where we last left off, we're trying to understand what was the business relationship between Joseph Mcstay and the defendant, Charles Merritt. Well, what we heard was Charles Merritt's interrogation tape 13 days after the family went missing. That's when he was interviewed. This was back in 2010. And he's telling investigators, we're going to play it for you right now, more about their financial dealings and their financial understandings. Take a look.
Would you correct? Do you know his credit card number? I did the QuickBooks Pro, and I threw the credit card. All I needed it for. He just wrote it down. Yeah, he just wrote it down. So you'll see on one of his whatever credit card, because I don't even remember which one it was. I think it was. I don't think it was Visa. I think it was. Do you remember what bank? I have no idea. And when did you do that? Was it prior to February 4th? No. It was 2, 3, or 4 days after February 4th that I actually bought the QuickBooks. Joseph and I sat down and talked about the QuickBooks because Summer didn't know how much money Joseph actually made, and she never did. And one of Summer's biggest problems is credit cards. I mean, she spends a lot of money. She goes to Ross all the time, things like that. So it's a big thing. It had become a big thing. Dan called me and said, "Hey, what are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know. I don't have any access to Joseph's emails. I don't have any access to any of this. I can't help him." And so Dan said, "Well, I can send you any pertinent emails. You can follow up with them. Any complaints, any problems with customers, can you try to deal with them so that when Joseph comes back, at least we've made an effort to, get this stuff taken care of." What date was that?
Okay, Dan, I don't want to read the tea leaves or guess something wrong here, but are you getting the sense from his interrogation tape that there's a little bit of, he had an issue with Summer?
Yeah, there's certainly some kind of anger there. So that
there is
that
right?
part of the, is that part of the motive to kill? That's a leap, it seems like, but whoever killed Mcstay also killed his family, and the prosecution is adding that again. This is a case where there's a lot of little facts that the prosecution is trying to bring together to show beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant's guilty of murder. There's no one fact that shows that he's the killer, but everything together, the prosecution argues, shows that he is.
It's interesting to get his police interrogation tape, both anytime you can listen to the defendant. I think it's really important for the jury, but let alone here, right after they went missing, and get some insight. So this is what we're doing right now. We're recapping testimony that you may have missed. Let's keep going with his police interrogation tape.
I don't remember calling him, and I wouldn't have had his number, I don't think. You know, it's possible that I got his number from Joseph's mom, but I don't think she would have had it. So he probably called me. It's more than likely he called me. It's kind of I'm not positive. We ended up making contact because Dan was concerned and wanted to know. Sure, it's your three business. Yeah, I mean different roles, but together you make a business. Yeah, and who else works in that business? Anybody, or is it just you three? Well, Joseph owns Earth Inspired Products. Dan runs the website. Dan, I believe, owns the website. Joseph was buying the website from him, and I know for a fact that Joseph only owed him $2,000 more, and it was paid off. And then he was only going to be paying him to run the website instead of paying him a percentage of sales. Okay? That's the extent that I know about Dan. As far as my role, I met Joseph. He actually contacted me to start building custom waterfalls 2.5–3 years ago. And I started building his custom waterfalls, and I'm still doing it now, today. And so I don't have really anything to do with Earth Inspired Products. I have my own, I manufacture waterfalls. You know, I had my own line of waterfalls, my own, everything. Joseph got me more deeply into the custom ones. And he does all the sales. Basically, I mean, yeah, we're partners in getting waterfalls done, and we make money, but.
Little discussion there about Dan Kavanaugh, and a huge discussion for the defense because they want to point the finger at this man. Now, you and I know what the jury doesn't, that the defense has all of these other messages from Dan Kavanaugh that they wanted to introduce, but they weren't allowed to. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So Dan Kavanaugh and Mcstay had a strong conflict with their messages showing a lot of anger back and forth dealing with finances and other issues. We also have, allegedly, Dan Kavanaugh made a statement to somebody else right after the bodies were found saying, in a different situation, I know how to make people disappear. That's the allegation. None of those statements are allowed into evidence. The defense obviously wants to bring them in. The prosecution objected, said it was too speculative. They said Dan Kavanaugh wasn't even in the continental United States, that he was in Hawaii at the time of the killings, and therefore it's not relevant. And the judge sided with the prosecution. And this shows that even though guilt and innocence is decided by a jury, how a judge rules on evidentiary motions is very critical. And one judge may rule one way, another judge may rule a different way. This judge's ruling is really hurtful to the defense.
But how much can the defense prove that? Do they, I mean, you tell me, do they have to bring in evidence that Dan Kavanaugh wasn't in Hawaii, that there's doubt that he was in Hawaii? They show access, motive? I mean, how much do they have to show that he was the person that committed this crime?
In order to get an acquittal?
Yes.
You need one juror to find reasonable doubt to stop a conviction. So it's unclear exactly what you need, but certainly if they could show that this other guy had financial motive, that he had made this comment to somebody else about, I know how to make people disappear, maybe one juror is going to find reasonable doubt, and at a minimum that will stop a conviction, even if it won't lead to an acquittal. But those statements can't come in. I would imagine if they had evidence that he was not in Hawaii, they would have offered that, because the prosecution said, look, you're taking comments from someone who wasn't even in the continental United States at the time of the disappearance.
But what comments they are?
There are strong comments. Look, if you're going to say the motive is financial conflict between this defendant and Mcstay, well, here's another business person who also had a conflict, and that's documented, and made this strange comment just days after the Mcstay family was found. He made a comment to someone else, allegedly, Dan Kavanaugh did, saying, I know how to make people disappear. that is something that if the defense could get in front of a jury, that's certainly red meat to help inflame the jury and feel, well, maybe there is somebody else. Maybe we should not convict here, but the judge isn't letting that in right now. That's tough for the defense.
I'll tell you, it's never easy sitting on a jury, let alone on this case, and we believe they're going to be seated for months on this trial. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to play more of Charles Merritt's interrogation tape. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about the Charles Merritt trial. We'll be back live there at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As soon as we have an update from the courtroom, we'll make sure to let you know. Right now, we're recapping testimony that you may have missed so that when trial starts up again, you're fully prepared. Let's go back to 2010. We're playing you when Charles Merritt was interviewed by the police. And right now, we're getting to the part that's really interesting. Thursday, February 4th, 2010 was the last day that the Mcstay family was known to be alive. It was believed that Joseph Mcstay and Charles Merritt met at a Chick-fil-A to discuss some projects, and according to the defendant, that was the last time he ever saw Mcstay. He's questioned about that by investigators. Let's see what he had to say.
So you're at Chick-fil-A till about 2 or 3. So you were there. We were there a couple of hours, an hour and a half, 2 hours. Yeah. And was that normal? Oh yeah. I mean, with Joseph, that's a very short amount of time. Did he usually meet you at Chick-fil-A, or did he usually come to your house or here? Or? We either met at Chick-fil-A, my house, where sometimes we met halfway. You know, we had his wife with him? No. And then he called on his way home a couple times? Yeah. Now, from home? I'm almost positive. Now, I'm trying to remember. I was trying to remember earlier when I wrote that down. I'm almost positive that he paid for Chick-fil-A with his credit card or ATM or whatever. So you'd probably be able to look that up. Because he bought lunch. He always buys lunch. And he ate. Yeah. He got food for both of us.
So what's the last time you actually, I knew you had seen him on the
Right. The last time I talked to him, he was sitting at his desk at home because I needed to talk. After we went over this stuff, there was still a question on the through box for the electrical on one of the waterfalls. But he had it at home. He had the drawings at home. So when he got there, he called me, and we went over that fairly quickly. And that he was sitting, I know that he was sitting at his desk at home, and I could hear the kids in the background, just like always. They were on.
Okay, Dan, there's only two people that know what that meeting was about, the defendant and the victim. The question for the jury, right, is ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong, is whether or not he was stealing money from Mcstay even before he disappeared and after, or were they really trying to figure out how to change access to the QuickBook accounts in order to cut out Dan Cavanaugh, that third-party suspect?
It's possible. There's other evidence, though, showing there was a feverish series of events going on between the defendant and Mcstay that day. There's multiple calls going back and forth before and after they meet. There's also the questionable financial things that happened on his QuickBooks account that seemed to suggest the defendant was writing a check to himself. So you see Mcstay calling the bank multiple times, interspersed with calling this guy, the defendant, to try to seemingly work it out. He's going back and forth between those phone calls, then meeting, and that's the last day this family was known to be alive. So that all comes together to paint a pretty bad picture.
It really does, but we'll talk more about that. Let's keep going with Charles Merritt's interview, and this is where he talks about how the disappearance affected him. Take a look.
Joseph and Joe's first. Joseph's not. And Summer was, again, I never saw any kind of jealousy, anything as far as jealousy, but again, if I were to guess, it's in her personality. So, I mean, that's just my, it was something that I would assume. It's not something that... What do you think happened to this family? You have to get around at least every hour. He does all of the sales. You know, Dan is trying to send me some emails and, you know, and try to need to try to salvage some of the jobs that are trying to send stuff back, because they can't get hold of Joseph, they're pissed off, things like that, and projects that people are calling in for saying, we're ready to do them, can you get hold of us? And I'm trying to call them and trying to, but I.
All right, Dan, we got to talk about this because something doesn't add up. Wouldn't it have been in his self-interest to say, you know what, Joseph Mcstay, maybe he did go to Mexico. You know what? He did have a lot of enemies. No, he says, in my opinion, he didn't go to Mexico, and everybody loved him. So somebody who committed this crime put the blame on somebody else. That's an interesting response. Right.
The defendant could have said that he had lots of enemies, and that might have been helpful. But what would have been the next question from the police? It would have been, tell me about those enemies. Who are they? What evidence do you have? Do you have communication? Can you tell us who they are so we could talk with them? And that would have put him in a bad spot, because if he doesn't have specific answers to that, what's he going to say? Oh, well, I was just talking generally, vaguely, I don't really know. That might not have looked good.
What about the Mexico line? Again, make it seem like they disappeared. They don't know where they went. Maybe they went off to Mexico. There's a reason the investigators asked him about that, because there was a suspicion that they had left.
Right, and there was footage of a family that, for a while, people thought might have been the Mcstay family going into Mexico. He could have gone along with that theory. Maybe he thought it was best for him that I'm just going to say I don't know anything relevant. I'm not going to say things that I don't know. Or maybe, as the defense is going to suggest, it's because he really wasn't guilty and he didn't know what to say because he wasn't involved in the killings.
Yeah, it's an interesting set of circumstances. Again, what the prosecution is trying to say is that he was embezzling funds before they went and disappeared, after, that he had a gambling problem and took those funds and went straight gambling afterwards. And have you seen cases where that becomes a motive, where that's actually a reason people kill someone?
Sure, people can kill people for financial motive, and often
debt, going and gambling, that kind of stuff.
You're right. And I was going to say the financial motive is often because someone has a gambling debt. We've seen that in other cases where someone has tremendous losses that they need to cover for. They need to get the money from somewhere. And sometimes also it's not based on a financial motivation to kill. It's that there's a financial conflict that's exacerbated by the stress of gambling debts that lead to this fight and sometimes a killing. We've seen that. But then again, you have to prove this specific defendant. Did he have that motivation, and did he kill for that reason, and can it be proven beyond a reasonable doubt?
And the defense is asking the jury to say, hey, wait a minute, this Dan Kavanaugh guy, he got cut out of a big deal. Chase was in, he was out. He had a reason not only to kill Joseph Mcstay, apparently, like you said, there was a conflict, but also to put the blame on this other guy, the defendant. I'm curious your thought on that.
Right. Well, Dan Kavanaugh had a real conflict with Mcstay. They were arguing, and there were some pretty severe comments going back and forth. And you also have Kavanaugh saying to someone else after the bodies were found, I know how to make people disappear. The defense would love to get that into evidence here, but the prosecution objected to it, said it was speculative, said Kavanaugh was not in the continental U.S., so it wasn't allowed. But the defense would love to get that statement in front of the jury.
Real quick, we got about 30 seconds. My question to you is, what's it like sitting on a jury in this kind of case?
It has to be very difficult because you have to pay a lot of attention. It's not a very clear-cut case. You have to piece together a lot of evidence, and that's difficult. And that challenge is put on the prosecutor at the end to explain to a jury that's not a professional, isn't a law enforcement analyst. How are they going to piece it together? The prosecution has to guide them. It's a lot of pressure on a jury. The jury's deciding whether a killer is either going to go free or convicted. Is the right person convicted? Is the wrong person convicted? That's a lot of pressure.
And they have to sit on this jury for apparently months. Not an easy task. Dan Schorr, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
It's great to talk with you.
Great talking with you. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the Mcstay family murder trial. We'll be right back.